Have you ever awakened more exhausted than when you fell asleep and realized that no amount of sleep will ever touch what truly wearies you? I have sat across from many men and women who describe precisely this condition to me, and I learned long ago to listen very carefully when they did, for it is not the fatigue of the body. The body has its own honest tiredness, the kind that comes after long work or a sleepless night, and that tiredness is simple. It yields to rest. It asks for nothing more than a quiet room and a few hours of forgetfulness. But there is another fatigue, far more profound, which no holiday can cure and no change of scenery can outrun. I have watched people flee to distant places, hoping to leave it behind, only to find it had travelled with them, waiting in the hotel room upon their return, as patient and as unforgetting as a debt that has not been paid. Perhaps you have known this weariness for years. You rise, you function, you fulfill your obligations. Judged from without, your life appears entirely reasonable. It is stable enough, orderly enough, sufficient enough to be called a life. And yet somewhere beneath this functioning, something in you has ceased to participate. It goes through the movements of the day. It answers when spoken to. It performs its duties with competence. But it does not enter into what it does. It enacts life without inhabiting it. What most terrified those who confessed this to me was not the heaviness itself, but the shame that accompanied it, for they could find no adequate reason for it. There had been no catastrophe, no great blow of fate that would justify such depletion. Nothing dramatic had announced its arrival. On an ordinary morning like any other, they simply awoke to a vast and silent emptiness, a depletion that had no name and no narrative, and they have carried it ever since, quietly, hoping that time alone might dissolve what time had not created. It has not dissolved. And I must tell you what no one else may have told you, that the exhaustion of which I speak has no relation to the number of hours you slept. It is not a matter of your schedule, nor of your industry, nor of whether you have learned to breathe correctly, or to move your body, or to nourish yourself according to the latest counsel. All these things may be useful in their own domain, but they do not reach this other fatigue, because this fatigue does not arise from what you do. It arises from the life you are living, or more precisely, from the life you have for many years not permitted yourself to live. This is not what the world now calls burnout, and the distinction is essential. Burnout belongs to the economy of energy. It says simply that more has been demanded of you than you could give, and that your resources have been spent. What I have encountered so often is different in its structure. Your resources are not empty. Your capacity remains. What has given way is something far more interior, something akin to consent. A part of you has quietly withdrawn its cooperation, not because it is diseased or defective, but because it has waited too long to be heard, and it will no longer lend its strength to a condition that denies it. Throughout my life I observed that every human being must fashion for himself a persona. I chose this word deliberately, for it was the name given to the masks worn by actors in antiquity. The persona is that face we prepare to meet the world, the necessary mediation between our inner reality and the expectations of family, of profession, of society. It is not in itself a falsehood. I have never regarded it as a mere pretense. It is a vital achievement, a necessary art of adaptation. Without it the child could not find his place among his kin, the man could not make himself intelligible among his fellows. The danger does not lie in having such a mask. The danger lies in what slowly and invisibly happens when we are compelled to maintain it at the cost of everything that will not fit behind it. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, I wrote of the many who came to me not because they were ill in the clinical sense, but because their lives had become strangely hollow. Outwardly, nothing was amiss, and yet at the center of their existence they felt an absence, a meaninglessness that could not be explained away. I came to understand that this hollowness was not merely a symptom of some other hidden disorder. It was the disorder itself, the loss of meaning, the feeling of moving through a life that no longer belongs to one. This is itself the affliction of our time, and it is this hollow that I wish to speak of with you now, not in order to offer you a quick means of filling it, but to help you comprehend what it is endeavoring to tell you. For it is telling you something, and it has been telling you for far longer than you have been willing to listen. What I shall place before you is not a diagnosis, it is a mirror. And what you discern within it will depend upon the degree of honesty you can bear to bring to your own reflection. Most imagine the persona as a conscious performance, a kind of polite dishonesty. They think of the rehearsed smile, the careful answer given at an interview, the agreeable face presented at a family gathering. If that were all it was, the remedy would be simple. One would need only to remove the mask and speak plainly. But what fascinated me most, and what I found far more troubling, was my discovery that the persona is not finally a lie we tell to others. It becomes the lie we tell to ourselves. It begins, as I have said, as adaptation, and adaptation is intelligent. The small child learns very early which aspects of his nature are welcomed and which are met with coldness or disapproval. The adolescent learns what manner of person is praised in his particular world, what ambitions are rewarded, what feelings are permitted. The young man or woman shapes an identity around what succeeds, what secures love, what avoids conflict, what opens doors. There is nothing cynical in this. It is the instinct for survival, seeking its form. The difficulty arrives much later, and it arrives so silently that we scarcely notice its coming. After years of speaking through the mask, of feeling through it, of choosing through it, the distinction between the mask and the face beneath it begins to dissolve. Not because we have become more genuine, but because we have forgotten that there was ever a distinction to be made. The persona, if worn long enough and under sufficient pressure, does not remain a covering. It fuses with the psyche. You no longer put it on in the morning, you become it. And it is precisely at that point, when the identification has become complete, that the peculiar exhaustion of which I speak first makes itself felt. I have often explained to my patients why this identification demands such an enormous and continuous expenditure of energy. For everything in you that does not conform to the persona does not simply vanish because you have ceased to acknowledge it. It must be held back, managed, kept out of sight. That holding is work, and though it is unconscious, though you do not feel yourself performing it from moment to moment, you feel its cost as a constant and inexplicable drain. You experience it as a flatness that will not lift however much you rest, as a restlessness that attaches to no object, as the quiet but persistent sense that the life you have so carefully constructed fits you as a garment might fit a stranger. You can wear it, you can appear well enough in it, but it was never cut to your measure. In the Undiscovered Self, I attempted to show how modern conditions hasten this estrangement. Our age does not ask for individuals. It asks for functioning units, predictable, productive, legible. It rewards in you precisely those qualities which make you interchangeable, and it quietly discourages everything idiosyncratic, everything unruly, everything that cannot be easily categorized. No one demands that you extinguish what does not fit. That would be too visible, too brutal. Instead, life makes it subtly inconvenient to keep it alive. An interest is left uncultivated because there is no time. A sensibility is set aside because there is no market for it. A tenderness or a fierceness is softened because it complicates relationships. And inconvenience, if it persists for years, achieves what violence could not. It slowly erases what it touches. What remains is a person who is entirely competent, entirely appropriate, entirely adequate to the expectations placed upon him, and who, in the solitude of his own interior, feels like a stranger to himself. Not in any dramatic way that would announce itself to the world, not in a manner that any examination could detect, but as a low and continuous ache, a sense that something essential has been living in darkness for a very long time, unattended and unheard. If you recognize yourself in what I describe, it is not because you are unusual. It is because you are human and have submitted, as we all must in some measure, to the same quiet bargain. The question that concerns us is not whether this has happened. The question is, what has been gathering in those neglected chambers of the soul while you were occupied elsewhere, and what it has been doing with all that time, for it has not been idle. And in what follows I would like to accompany you there into the territory of the life that was never permitted to unfold, for it does not cease to exist simply because you have ceased to look at it. There is a life within you which never had the opportunity to become actual. I do not mean a fantasy of perfection, nor an idealized image of who you might have been had you been stronger or more fortunate. I mean something far more concrete and far more unsettling. I mean the genuine impulses, the authentic desires, the characteristic gestures of your nature that were present from the beginning, that were undeniably real, and that were gradually ruled out, not through one decisive renunciation, but through 1,000 small accommodations, each so reasonable at the time that you scarcely registered it as a loss. You learned what was acceptable, and you adjusted yourself accordingly, and what did not fit the frame was left behind. I have called this the unlived life, and what I discovered about it over decades of observation was not simply that it causes suffering. That would be obvious enough. What struck me far more deeply was my realization that it does not dissolve with neglect. This is the error most people make. They imagine that what they have suppressed, what they have put out of mind for years, has somehow ceased to be. Conscious attention withdraws, life proceeds, and they assume that what was not chosen has faded away. But the psychic energy bound up in that unlived possibility does not evaporate. It accumulates. It seeks other pathways, and if denied direct expression, it begins to turn against the very structure that denied it. Not out of malice, not out of a wish to destroy, but out of the simple and indestructible will to exist. For existence is what it sought from the beginning, before you were taught to prevent it. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, I described the many men and women who came to me in the second half of their lives. They were often successful by every external standard, adapted, respected, secure, and yet they carried a weight for which they had no words. When I looked more closely, what I found again and again was not a trauma in the narrow clinical sense, but an accumulation of unlived possibility. Ambitions that had been dismissed as impractical, loves that had been forsaken as unsuitable, qualities of character that had been judged too intense, too peculiar, too inconvenient to be accommodated. None of it had gone. All of it had been waiting, conserved in the unconscious as if in a vault, gathering pressure with each passing year. You know the presence of this unlived life even if you have never possessed a language for it. You know it in the inexplicable resistance you feel toward things that should by all reason be acceptable to you. You know it in the procrastination that has nothing to do with indolence, in the irritability that fastens itself to the wrong object, in the sudden sorrow that descends without occasion and without permission. These are not malfunctions of a mechanism. They are transmissions. They are the unlived life seeking a channel through which it may finally speak, employing whatever symptom the conscious mind cannot easily ignore. And I must speak to you of a harder truth that I learned to recognize without exception. The more impeccably you have maintained the persona, the more completely you have succeeded in adapting to what was expected of you, the greater the pressure that has gathered beneath it. For every accommodation has its price, and the price is paid in the currency of unlived reality. What has been excluded does not wait with infinite patience. At first it whispers. In time, if the whisper is not heard, it begins to push. What you can do, even today, even in this hour, is to begin to treat these signals differently. Not by subduing them more efficiently, not by explaining them away with clever analysis, but by sitting with them long enough to ask what they are pointing toward. When that familiar flatness descends upon you, instead of fighting it or fleeing from it, you might ask it, with genuine curiosity, what it is protecting. When that resistance rises, you might inquire what unlived impulse it carries. The answer will not come at once. The unconscious does not respond to interrogation. But the act itself, the simple and sincere act of asking without an agenda, without demanding an immediate solution, alters the relationship between the conscious mind and what has been buried. It is the beginning of a different kind of listening. You must understand that the exhaustion you feel is not formless. It possesses a shape, a history, a precise psychological meaning, and that shape has a name. For when the deeper totality of the psyche withdraws its support from the narrow life the ego has constructed, a very particular condition arises, one which I spent many years attempting to describe. To comprehend it changes entirely how you read the story of your own fatigue, and it is there that we must turn next. You have likely been taught to think of exhaustion as a matter of expenditure and replenishment. You give out more than you take in, and therefore you must rest, do less, fill yourself again. This logic is adequate for the fatigue of the body and for the simple condition of burnout. But it is entirely inadequate for what you are enduring now, because what you are enduring does not obey the logic of input and output. What I diagnosed in those who came to me with this deeper weariness was structurally different. It was not that they were spending too much of themselves. It was that they were spending their energy to sustain something that was not themselves. To make this intelligible, I must speak of a distinction that became central to all my later work, the distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is that small and necessary center of consciousness with which you most immediately identify. It is the narrator of your life, the planner, the manager who negotiates the demands of each day. The self, by contrast, is vastly larger. It is the totality of the psyche, the whole that encompasses both what you know of yourself and what remains hidden from you, both what has been lived and what has been left unlived. The ego is who you imagine yourself to be. The self is who you are in your completeness. And the crucial fact I wish you to grasp is that the self is not passive. It is not a mere background against which the ego performs. It acts, it responds. It has its own intentionality. When the ego constructs a life that systematically excludes essential portions of the self, when the persona becomes the only identity that is inhabited and the unlived life continues to accumulate its pressure in the unconscious, then the self begins to resist. It does not do so dramatically. There is no sudden collapse, no theatrical crisis. Its resistance is quieter and far more relentless. It withdraws its cooperation. It no longer animates the enterprise it has been asked to support. The fatigue that will not lift, the apathy that settles over days that should be full, the emptiness at the very center of a competent life, all these are expressions of that withdrawal. In the Undiscovered Self, I argued that modern man has lost contact with his instinctual foundations, with those deepest strata of the psyche that do not obey the logic of society, that cannot be rationalized into a presentable identity that exists independently of what culture expects from us. This loss does not announce itself as a dramatic event. It manifests as structural exhaustion, as the feeling that one is moving through the world with something essential disconnected, as if the current that should animate the limbs were flowing elsewhere. Allow me to say this with all the emphasis it deserves. This condition is not weakness. It is not a failure of character. It is the most honest communication your psyche has yet produced, delivered not in words, which could be evaded, but in the withdrawal of the very energy required to continue pretending. What I therefore ask of you is a fundamental reversal of attitude. Cease for a time to treat this exhaustion as a problem to be solved and begin to treat it as a message to be deciphered. The question is no longer, how do I recover my energy, as if energy were a substance you had misplaced. The question becomes far more searching. What is it that has been consuming my energy without my conscious consent? What is the self attempting to make room for that the ego has steadfastly refused to acknowledge? This reorientation is not comfortable, for the moment you take it seriously you can no longer assign the cause of your suffering to your schedule, your circumstances, or your biology alone. The exhaustion ceases to be something that has happened to you from without, and reveals itself as something happening within you, a pressure from below, intelligent and purposeful, pointing toward a life that is larger, stranger, and more demanding than the one you have permitted yourself to live. This pressure, as I observed over many years, does not increase indefinitely without reaching a culmination. It tends to gather toward a particular moment, a turning point that I came to map with considerable precision, a moment that most experience as collapse, and that I came to understand as something entirely different. It is to that threshold that we must now turn our attention. There comes a time, and you may find yourself within it now, when the structure that has carried you thus far simply ceases to carry you further. I do not mean that it collapses in a sudden catastrophe. The process is quieter. The ambitions that once lent urgency to your days begin to feel curiously hollow. The identity you assembled with such diligence begins to fit you strangely, as though you had outgrown it without noticing. The things you were once certain you wanted, you may have even attained, and you discover that the wanting itself has died somewhere along the path, leaving the achievement strangely lifeless in your hands. What once felt like direction now feels like momentum without meaning. You continue to move, but you no longer know for what purpose. I called this the turning point of the middle of life, and I was careful to emphasize that it has little to do with chronological age in any mechanical sense. It arrives whenever the values, the orientations, and the identity that served the first half of life have exhausted their usefulness. It arrives when the ego, having successfully built a life around adaptation, performance, and acquisition, comes to the end of the road that those principles could build. I often compared this movement to the course of the sun. In the morning the sun rises, expanding, brightening, moving ever outward. All the tasks of the first half of life obey this morning logic. To build, to acquire, to achieve, to establish oneself in the world. But at noon a reversal occurs. The trajectory that produced the ascent must now produce the descent. And the person who attempts to prolong the morning indefinitely, who tries to climb further using the same values, the same definitions of success, the same strategies that carried him upward, that person, I observed, pays for his persistence with his soul. In Modern Man, In Search of a Soul, I wrote at length about those who came to my consulting room in precisely this condition. Externally, their lives were intact, even enviable. Internally, something had gone dark. They had done everything that was asked of them and had arrived at a destination that felt like an impasse. What they were experiencing was not failure in the ordinary sense. It was the psyche's indication that the agenda of the first half was complete and that something else was now required, something the ego alone could not supply. This is the moment that is most fatefully misinterpreted. If you understand it as a collapse, you will respond with repair. You will attempt to restore what was previously working. You will push harder, optimize more thoroughly, add new techniques atop old foundations, and the exhaustion will deepen, because the psyche is not asking to be repaired. It is asking to be transformed. The difference between collapse and threshold is everything, and I would have you hold this distinction with great care. Collapse is the ending of something. Threshold is the beginning of something you have not yet become. What stands beyond it, what I devoted the whole of my later work to comprehending, is not a new persona, not a better performance, but a relationship with the full depth of who you actually are, rather than the narrow segment of yourself that your circumstances once required you to inhabit. You cannot think your way across this threshold. You cannot optimize your way across it. The intellect, so useful in the morning of life, is of little use here. What you can do, and what I will now ask you to consider, is to learn to listen differently to what the exhaustion has been endeavoring to say all along. For beneath it there is something specific, something that has waited with extraordinary patience for your attention, and the time has come to discover what it is. Cease for a moment the effort to fix yourself. I do not ask this as a permanent philosophy, nor as a denial of practical necessity. I ask it only as an experiment, long enough to permit a different question to emerge, for the questions you have been asking, though entirely reasonable, have not led you out of this condition. How do I recover? How do I regain my energy? How do I feel like myself again? These questions all share an unexamined premise, that exhaustion is an obstacle standing between you and the life you desire. I have come to see the matter in the opposite way. Exhaustion is the most direct path toward that life, if you have the courage to follow it inward. Every persistent symptom in the psyche is guarding something. The anxiety that will not resolve is protecting a truth you have not yet been willing to see. The numbness that follows years of overperformance is preserving the remnants of a self that was never given sufficient space to exist. And the exhaustion we have been tracing together, that structural, resistant exhaustion that no rest can relieve, is protecting the unlived life beneath it. It is the pressure of everything that has been compressed, repressed, and denied, bearing upward against the weight of the identity you agreed to become. I do not speak here in metaphor. I speak of mechanics. When psychic energy cannot flow in its natural direction toward genuine expression, toward what the self actually requires for its wholeness, it does not simply disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, and it begins to deform whatever it touches. Relationships feel curiously flat because the vitality that should animate them is bound elsewhere. Work feels meaningless because the investment of care it demands exceeds what the depleted ego can any longer provide. Pleasure becomes difficult to access, not because pleasure is absent from the world, but because pleasure requires presence, and presence requires that you actually be there. Not the persona, not the performed version of yourself, but you in your undivided reality. In the Undiscovered Self, I argued that genuine self-knowledge, the kind that actually alters a life, is not knowledge about the conscious personality. The conscious personality already knows its own preferences, its history, its habits. It can recite them with fluency. What it does not know, and what it is often profoundly resistant to knowing, is the nature of what it has excluded. And it is precisely that exclusion which is costing you everything. The energy you seek is not missing. It is invested in the act of exclusion.